Well, welcome to the show this morning. We have a very unique and interesting guest. His name is Michael Harrison. He is the editor of Talkers Magazine. He's also the host of the Michael Harrison Rap, which is a weekly show heard on the Talk Media Network, which is a radio syndication network. As well as he hosts a podcast, the Michael Harrison Interview, which is heard on Podcast One. But we're having him on because you all know, if you spend any time listening to me, I spend a lot of time talking about music. I spend a lot of time talking about music radio. It's a great passion of mine. Michael is here in a very unique capacity. Last week marked the 54th anniversary of the birth of a giant radio station, both in my own personal universe, because it's all about me, but also in the universe of rock radio and music radio, the birth of the modern version of WNEW FM in New York. Michael became a DJ there, and then we're going to talk to him about that. But we're going to talk to him about the birth of a format that he had a massive hand, if not the hand, in creating, the AOR, or album-oriented rock format. Michael, listen, so glad you can join me today. Let's start here. When did you fall in love with radio as a medium?
I fell in love with radio as a kid. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area. I was born in Brooklyn, lived a little bit in Queens, then grew up on Long Island as a kid, and went to college on Long Island, and I started in radio on Long Island. So that's my background. And obviously, if I was part of the early NEW, I've been around the track a few times. So my childhood goes back to the 50s, and I was very fortunate. We had two kids in my family, and I was the baby of the family. I had a sister who's 8 years older than me. So she was in the 50s, a teenager, and I was in the aughts, but we were very close. She took me with her to everything she did. I went out on dates with her. I was sitting in the back seat. I got to witness teenage life in the 50s as a kid at 8 years old, 7 years old. And my love for rock and roll, for pop music, for dancing, for the whole scene of the 50s gelled and stayed with me for my entire life.
Remind me, did she take you to see the Beatles at Shea Stadium?
No. By the time the Beatles came, I was already a teenager.
Got it.
And she was already, off and married. We're talking the age of Little Richard. We're talking about, and part of what I forgot to mention is that during that time, some of the greatest seminal rock and roll radio was happening in New York, which I listened to. And I used to listen to Alan Freed every night on WINS. And I used to listen to the countdowns and the top 40 shows, and I would make my own charts. I would design to see, because there were like 4 top 40 radio stations in New York, and I noticed some of them had different number ones. I started figuring out this is a subjective thing. This is not coming from the government.
Okay.
I started making my own charts and seeing how close I was to them, and then I started to judge them on which ones were most accurate, because I was able to tell from my friends what was really popular and not. And of course, I went on to, among the many things I did in my life, is I designed the charts at Radio and Records. Okay. I redesigned the charts at Billboard magazine. Oh, wow. And then I introduced the idea of topic charts for talkers for talk radio.
Sure.
All of this goes back to those particular days. I gave you a long answer to your question, but I don't know if we can talk about this.
Well, no, because it gets down to something I've talked about, obviously, with program directors, the concept of playing the hits when you're talking about, news topics. And so being able to discern, right, have an ear, right, you obviously have the ear for music, but to have an ear for what's happening outside and what is resonating with people, it's really the same thing, isn't it, Michael?
Oh, it's absolutely the same thing, because ultimately one man's gut is another man's research.
Sure.
There is no empirical research that will tell you the truth about human nature and the mystery of public taste. Ultimately, it comes from your gut.
It's funny. I just had a conversation with Glenn DeVries, one of the astronauts who went up in Blue Origin, and we were talking about qualitative versus quantitative data, and that seems to get into that area. So shifting gears, because it's funny. I also, as you know, grew up in New York. WNEW became the station that I listened to after, and I think there's a transition that kids make. I listened to stations like WABC, when WABC was a pop top 40 station. And I'll talk to you about that in a second. Then I listened to the Morning Zoo pop radio Z100 in New York. It's funny, as a kid, I didn't have a concept for what radio was. And so I thought that all of, I'd listen to WABC on my little transistor radio, and I would think that the bands were actually coming in and out of the studio, which is sort of which
really
earlier on there were, yeah. I thought,
well,
wow,
that's a throwback. That's a throwback to early radio when the bands were in the studio.
Yes,
and when the DJ came on the scene, the musicians union complained bitterly that this is the death of music and radio because it's now fake. It's automated. And one of the original DJ shows was called the Make Believe Ballroom.
Oh, sure.
They actually, yeah. So you weren't that unusual in terms of your perception.
It's one of those things. You move on, but let's talk about this, because we're going to get into the music and we're going to get into what set WNEW apart. But you talk about the personalities. We won't get into what we were talking about beforehand. But personality and that love for the format. Talk about being a DJ as an art form, or radio as an art form.
I've always seen radio as an art form. And one of the problems with today's radio is it is no longer really the art form that it was. The format of the radio station, the flow of the station, the identity, the stationality, if you will, the jingles or the lack of jingles, the similarity between the DJs as well as the differences. It was a nuanced thing, but you would never have dead air. You would never have noise from the background. Everything was pristine as much as it could be for the technology. And there was a momentum and a feel to radio stations. You can even hear the sound of the technology. Certain transmitters had one sound, others had another. I could tell all that as a kid. It was an art form. So when progressive rock radio popped up on the FM dial, which was considered, FM was not real radio.
Yeah.
It was sort of like what streaming was back in 1999, 2000. It was an alternative that was in many ways better, but not ubiquitous in its distribution, therefore not real. And the whole paradigm shift of the DJ without a lot of commercials, but they didn't have commercials. That's why there weren't a lot of commercials. Playing long tracks, talking sort of like I'm talking to you right now, as opposed to putting on that whole WABC type of a thing. It was a major leap in terms of the staging, and it was like Cinerama versus Charlie Chaplin black and white flickers.
I like that analogy. No, that's a great analogy. It's interesting because I've thought a lot about sort of, where I learned sort of my approach to radio and talking about pacing and energy. And you talk about the sort of, you're right, this kind of this issue of the identity. In terms of the talk radio side, that's why folks who have come out of, I think, the top 40 side of things have been so successful, because they bring a certain degree of energy, and they understand pacing and how to sort of keep people engaged.
The mechanics.
What was that?
The mechanics.
Yes,
very important.
Absolutely. But when you talk about, and we'll talk about sort of this changeover. I mean, obviously there was a sea change happening in America in the mid to late 60s. Things happening politically. We don't have to touch on that, though that does play a role. Obviously, what was happening with the music was changing drastically. And so music with an explanation, and having, if we're talking about radio as theater of the mind and DJs having direct relationships with their listeners, one of the things that I've taught students, when I talk to kids who are doing college radio, is you have to explain, people are tuning into you for a reason. They want to hear your perspective on this. They want to know why you're choosing the music that you're choosing. This gets back to what was happening on WNEW, and we can talk about WLIR as well, but talk about that.
Well, it's true. You were a guru. To be a disc jockey on a progressive rock station circa 1967, 8, 9, 70, 1, 2, 3, and on into the 70s was it was like being a talk show host. People tuned in to hear your take on things. You were not just a voice as part of a format and under management that says shut up and play the music. Your commentary was part of the presentation, your attitude and your musicological, we use that term, we were musicologists. We took ourselves very seriously.
Of course.
Which I look back now and I realize some of it was snobbery and some of it was showbiz and some of it was real. So, as the years go by, I look back differently. But it was, for me, at the age of 21 years old, to be the morning man on WNEW FM was like if I were drafted out of high school or college to be on the Yankees.
Sure.
There was and it was only, the station had only, I was a second generation of what were hundreds of generations.
Yeah.
The station was on the air for a few years before I landed in that position. But I was one of the first newcomers after the original staff started to fall apart. And to me, it was like, oh my gosh, I now am a cultural leader. I have to rise to this. And that's the way we looked at it, just a broadcaster, but also somebody very involved in the popular culture. And you mentioned before the politics. We won't talk about the politics.
Oh, we can talk about politics,
but it was key to it. It was political, it was cultural, it was generational, and we thought it was just the most important thing in the world.
Let's talk about this for a second, right? Because so I started listening to NEW, I was probably in my early teens. So we're talking about the 1980s, and things had switched over. You had the Dave Herman Rock and Roll Morning Show on WNEW, which I'm not going to say was a zoo format, because it was not the Scott Shannon Z100 Z Morning Zoo kind of a thing, but it was certainly not, it was not your late night kind of a talk radio show. Talk about how it was doing morning radio on an FM format in the 1970s, because I think there's a real kind of a bank shot here that we're talking about. You're talking to people who are in their cars, or if they could listen to the radio at work. Talk about your audience and how you would approach it in the early 1970s.
Mostly we were talking to college students in their dorms. That was the cars did not have FM. When I went to NEW in 1971, there were not a lot of FMs in cars. At that time, the nighttime was considered prime time. The star of the station was on from 6 to 10 p.m. rather, 6 to 10 p.m. And then the 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift was the second biggest one. Overnight had a cachet to it. The least important time was morning drive. That's how I got it as a youngster.
Makes sense.
And then the midday, 10 a.m. to 2, was considered to be a little bit better. And then 2 to 6 drive time, afternoon, was considered good. And then nighttime.
Yeah.
So I was on a time that was considered to be sort of a throwaway.
Sure.
But what I did was the unexpected. I wound up being the highest rated in Arbitron DJ on the station.
Wow.
Because I did something different than the other ones did. I was playing to audience tastes. And during that time, more and more people were getting car translators.
Okay.
Actually, that wasn't the word. There's another word. Converters.
Okay.
They were selling at Radio Shack. They were selling FM converters to cars, and you would hook it onto your dashboard and plug it into the radio. And now you'd be able to get the FM dial.
Wow.
So more and more people were listening in their cars. During that time, I wound up with tremendous Arbitron numbers. There was a little bit of resentment about me among the older crowd from the first generation. There was the politics and all of that. But the reason I was able to get numbers was I was the first one to say, wait a second, the audience likes certain songs more than other songs.
Yeah.
I started to think about hits.
Absolutely.
And there was a great controversy within the halls of progressive rock radio stations as to, we don't play hits, we play what we like. And they started to play as much esoteria as they could, esoteric music, to please each other, and I wouldn't do that. So I was at the beginning of what was going to be AOR. That was starting to album-oriented rock, as opposed to this progressive, which was a very subjective kind of, it became kind of phony, in my opinion.
Okay.
And I'm more progressive than you,
of course,
as opposed to I'm a broadcaster trying to create a new format here that's going to succeed with getting advertising agencies to buy commercials and have a real business here. And that's where I left NEW and started AOR.
It's funny you bring that up, that debate and discussion, because, so as I said, I've been fascinated by radio since I was a kid. Was doing college radio at my college radio station, WCWM, in Williamsburg, where I live now. and that was always the debate and discussion. There was an A list and a B list, and you had to play something, at least one song from the A list and one song from the B list, and of course it was all of this very esoteric, very hoity hoi polloi, highfalutin, new wave. New wave is not the right word, because new wave would have been good, but whatever, garbagey college rock sort of stuff.
Underground. It was underground as opposed to mainstream.
And there was always the debate between whether or not the station should be more oriented towards people playing what they want. And I kind of go along with it. I think, if you're doing a college radio show, you should be able to play what you want. I played classic rock and blues. But other folks wanted to turn it into a pop station. So you go to California, right? Am I understanding this? You go from New York to San Diego. Was your station broadcasting out of Mexico? Did I read that correctly?
No, that's not true.
Okay.
It would never have reached San Diego if it was broadcasting out of Mexico, because it had such a small signal. I went to a station, KPRI at 106.5. And it was a small, independently owned station. Most stations in those days were independently owned. And it was competing against a mighty rock station called KGB AM and FM that was being programmed by a very famous program director of the name of Ron Jacobs, whose claim to fame had been Boss Radio, KHJ in Los Angeles. And he was doing at KGB kind of a variation of what I had been working on. He didn't call it AOR, they called it rock.
Yeah.
But it was AOR. And he was good at it. And I was hired by this station under the deal that I could do AOR. I could show everybody what it is. But here I am up against Jacobs. And Billboard magazine used to write about Jacobs every week, like he was God's gift to radio. And I was just this kid from New York that nobody on the West Coast knew with my AOR thing.
But time out for a
second.
I
went.
Michael, time out for a second. So I just want to get the timetable clear. So you're in Southern California in the mid 1970s?
I went to Southern California in early 1973.
Okay.
And worked WLIR, KPRI rather, until 75, at which point I moved to LA. Because during the time that I was at KPRI in the early 70s in California doing AOR on the air, I became an editor of the brand new trade publication Radio and Records, where I was writing about AOR for the rest of the nation to see. And that counterpointed Billboard's writing about Ron Jacobs, and it built. So I was part of the original team building Radio and Records at the same time I was building AOR.
But my point is, you're in Southern California, right at the obviously we had the folk rock sound of the late 1960s, the Laurel Canyon sound, but that transformed into this, Southern California country rock sound, Linda Ronstadt, the Eagles, etc.
We played more of that at NEW.
Is that right?
We did. Yeah, I remember I was on KPRI, one of the first shows I was doing, and I was playing one of those type of things. And I pick up the phone from a listener, and they go, "Get that blank blank hayseed country blank off the air and play some boogie."
There you go. That's funny.
And that was whoa, what an eye opener. We were much more interested in the Linda Ronstadts and the James Taylors and the Carole Kings and the Peter, Paul and Marys and all of that type of music back at NEW in the early 70s.
Wow.
Then the audience listening to album rock was on the West Coast. They were more into heavy metal and boogie and ZZ Top and all that. Look, you and I could go down the rabbit hole of minutia about all of this, but the point is that there already were the seeds of different interpretations of this culture being fought out in I call them radio wars. And, people go, "Oh, it was such a golden day. Everybody got along and we played whatever we..." No, we fought like cats and dogs at every radio station over which direction we were going to go in. And one of the reasons that AOR emerged is I was a hell of a fighter. I had Radio and Records going for me. I had a big mouth. I was pretty talented on the air. I knew my music. And I was influential, but it was a fight. To this day, I wake up screaming.
That's interesting. Yes, you have your traumas from it. I get that. So you spend that time that you're in LA. You get this sort of rooted. Now, when do you make your way back to WLIR?
I had never made my way back to LIR.
Oh,
LIR was how I got to WNEW.
got it. That
I
makes
I
sense.
I started WLIR as a rock station on Long Island prior to NEW, and was discovered because LIR was pretty successful.
Yes.
I was a college kid on Long Island. WLIR was a place that I was working as a staff announcer while I was working my way through college playing Mantovani music. It was a totally obscure radio station
Sure.
located in the basement of the Garden City Hotel at 92.7 on the dial, owned by a mom and a pop, a real mom and a real pop.
Yeah.
And they were having trouble. And after 2.5 years of them getting to know me, and I was getting more mature and still in school, I talked them into making me program director and changing the format to progressive rock to compete against WNEW FM
There
in
you
that
go.
lucrative Nassau County, Long Island market. And it was such a huge success that 9 months later, after we kicked it off on July 20th or whatever it was, or July 2nd, rather, 1970, I was hired to do mornings at WNEW FM when Roscoe left. You may remember the
Okay.
name Roscoe.
Oh,
When
yeah.
Roscoe left, they shifted the dial around. They moved Pete Fornatel out of the morning and put him into middays.
Wow.
They took Jonathan Schwartz from middays and put him into the coveted 6 to 10 p.m. position. Zachary quit shortly after that to go to WPLJ, and they moved Allison Steele, the Nightbird, from the
Nightbird.
overnight to 10 to 2. And then they moved my buddy from LIR, Richard Neer, into the overnights. That's how that all
astounding.
happened in 1972.
I mean, it was a real. I mean, I'm going to say an incubator, and I know. Listen, it's New York, so there are a lot of fans of WNEW who are out there, and it was to me a real shame. As much as I liked seeing, Don and Mike go on to go and do talk on WNEW in New York. When WNEW shifted away from music and into a talk format, there was certainly a part of my childhood was lost. But you talk about this. So you've been a part of some of these major pioneering stations, pioneering movements. I mean, as I think about it, because WLIR became a massive giant in terms of the approach to new wave and alternative rock, and then obviously NEW, and then the work with AOR. Why? I mean, besides, so so many questions I could go down this road. Michael,
Well, we can make a series out of this.
Oh well, without a doubt, and I know you're and I know you're short for time, but so I've written a couple of pieces about. I think radio has a long life to it. Is there going to be a time when music radio has a return to having personalities behind microphones introducing the music, or is that all over and done with because of the corporatization of music radio?
I never like to pronounce anything dead, and I don't have
good.
a crystal ball. However, I do think it's a long shot for AM and FM radio as we know it to see a comeback of music as its primary product, and AM and FM music radio being a primary motivation for popular culture. You see, it was a couple of things that were going on there. Not only was radio the vehicle for music, but it was the source of where young people got their information to be part of a culture. I don't think it's going to happen again because I don't see the will to do it within today's corporate structure. If there was the will to do it, anything has a fighting chance.
Sure.
Of course, the very nature of what is radio is the question of the hour as we go forward into the 21st century.
No, well, we'll talk about that. I mean, before I let you go, because that is such a vital question to ask. It's this issue of why are people going to radio, and it's because they want to make that connection, or they want to have a conversation, or they want to learn something, or they want to feel better about something. I mean, there's always going to be, I think, that hunger there, and I think you would agree with that.
There's no question.
Yeah.
I just hope that people in the radio industry understand that.
Yeah.
When, I wonder how connected to the radio industry and the magic that created radio, a lot of today's captains of industry within radio are. Many of them are very corporate. They're very concerned about paying down debt. They're bean counters.
Sure.
They're into numbers. And they know they've got to create cross-platform, media stations, which is what I call the station today, is a media station.
That makes sense.
But they don't have a inherent understanding of what it's like to be a radio fan.
Yeah.
And all of
Mm.
these art forms, whether it's cinema, whether it's running a baseball team, whatever it is, if you have, when the operator has an understanding of the fan's perspective,
Yeah.
then you create a product that has magic. If you don't have an understanding of the fan's perspective, you just create something that is designed to target an audience based upon moment to moment tastes,
You know,
and it's not the same.
it's funny because before he got, and I think unfortunately axed from WJFK, the big sports talk station in DC, Chad Dukes, who now podcasts, he was on the right track. You talk about stations as media platforms, radio stations as media platforms. You know, Chad is entrepreneurial, right? He had his main radio show. He now owns a store in Fairfax, but he was always doing these one-off podcasts based upon what he saw. I mean, it was stuff that he wanted to do, but also based upon what he saw as what his fans wanted, including incidentally doing a podcast about the business of radio. You know, talking with folks he'd been in radio with, and I think that's, you know, more stations need to understand that there are these folks are clamoring for outlets. It's the same reason why, you know, on WBAL I've been so I always wanted to talk, in addition to talking about politics, talking about music, because it was something I knew that my listeners wanted. I think you're absolutely correct, Michael. Once again, before I let you go, so how can folks find out the various things that you're up to?
Talkers.com is the way to go.
Yes.
And I answer all my email, michael@talkers.com. I love talking to listeners and to fans of the media, and it keeps me very plugged into what we talked about before. I think that radio must be connected to the people, to the street, to the grassroots, local, and to the culture. And I'm still fascinated by all of that stuff, and that's why I'm still in the business.
You and me both, and you can catch Michael on the Michael Harrison Interview podcast, which can be found on Podcast One. The host of the weekly show, the Michael Harrison Wrap, which can be heard on the Talk Media Network. And Michael, right? Happy anniversary to WNEW, 54 years. I mean, obviously they're not doing music anymore, but 54
it's
years.
Great. It's a great milestone
Yes.
for those of us that have an appreciation of the history of radio, which is now 100 years old. And for
Wow.
those of us who have an appreciation of popular music and the relationship between it and the culture. And let's face it, for those who have a soft spot in their heart for the history of the post-war baby boomers.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Andrew, thank you. It's been an honor to be on your show. Thank you.